Once again, it's wonderful to see all of you here this morning. Also, would like to welcome those who are joining us by radio. Thank you for tuning in. This Sunday morning, we are once again in Romans chapter 13 for our series titled, If They Made It, You Can Too. Now, last Sunday, we looked at the life of Martin Luther and his wife, Katie. If you remember this series, last Sunday's message was titled, When Both Are Hard-Headed. And both Martin and Katie were hard-headed individuals, but by the grace of God, they were able to make it. And this morning, we are in the second series message, which is When There Is a Thorn in the Flesh. Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10, and let's all stand together. Owe no one anything except to love one another. For he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet, and if there is any other commandment, are all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Would you bow your heads in prayer? Heavenly Father, once again, teach us to love. Not when it is comfortable and things are going our way, but teach us to love when there are thorns in the flesh, when things are painful. Holy Spirit, we look to you this morning to guide us through your word and help us, Lord, to understand true love. In Jesus' name we pray, and let all people say, amen. You may be seated. Now, as you know, we're basing this series on Romans chapter 13, verse 9 and verse 10. I want you to hear those two lines once again. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. The first statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, is a commandment. That's what you should do. Some people call that the 11th commandment. The second statement, love does no harm to a neighbor, is a test if you are truly keeping that commandment. The question this morning is, do you really love? Now, surely I can say I love my neighbor, but the test is this: if you say you love someone, do they feel safe with you? Because love does no harm to a neighbor. If you say someone loves you, the question is, do you feel safe with them? Because love does no harm to a neighbor. And if you remember from last week, my nearest neighbor is my spouse. My nearest neighbor are people in my family. And the question then is, do they feel safe with you? Do you feel safe with them? Because that is true love. They may know your deepest secrets, but they will never share it with the world. They may know your greatest weakness, but they will never throw it in your face, because in many homes, in many marriages, that's exactly what happens. Things are shared in private, in confidence, and the next thing you know, they're being thrown out in public. People know your deepest weaknesses, and instead of praying for that person, encouraging that person, when the going gets tough, we take those things and we smear them in their face. And that's wrong. That goes against verse 10, love does no harm to a neighbor. It is safe. And this morning, we are looking at the marriage of Charles and Susie Spurgeon. Now, who were they? Now, if you have been hearing me preach for some time, I'm sure you have heard the name Charles Spurgeon. Let me give you a little information on this man, some fast facts about him. Although there have been many great preachers in history, Charles Spurgeon still holds the title Prince of Preachers. When he came to the New Park Street Church in 1854, just 19 years of age, there were only 200 members in church. 38 years later, when he finished his ministry and he died, there were over 14,000 members. At one time, he had as many as 12,000 people in the audience with him and 10,000 waiting outside who couldn't find a seat. One time he told the audience, now how many pastors would do that? He said, please stay home next Sunday so other people can come and hear the message. And one time, the entire audience got up and walked out so the people outside could come in and sit, and they did. Immediately, the entire place was filled again. This was Charles Spurgeon. Let me tell you a few more things about him. He was a soul winner like no other. Once he was in a large auditorium and he began to test the acoustics, and he said as loud as he could, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And his voice carried up through the rafters, and there was a man working up there getting ready for the big meeting. He heard those words and he got saved. A housewife was unwrapping this piece of butter that she had bought, and the paper happened to be the sermon of Charles Spurgeon. Just one sheet of paper. She read that and she got saved. This man, just in that short life, in 1865, we know that he sold as many as 25,000 copies a week of his sermon, every week. Even to this day, he is the most widely read preacher of all times. He missed the opportunity to go to college, but start a college of his own. In his personal library, and I can tell my wife this, but she doesn't make any exceptions for me, he had 12,000 books. Can you imagine that library? 12,000 books. Every week he read 6 books. Now we have trouble with one. We're still working on that one from last Christmas, and I'm talking about a year ago. And he is reading 6 books a week. And you could ask him anywhere, anytime about that book, and he could tell you the page and the paragraph and where it's located. This was Charles Spurgeon. Let me tell you one more thing about him, and then we're going to move on. And this will bring it as relevant as possible of how much an impact he's made on our lives. He insisted, when they expanded their building, he insisted that the new building not look like a cathedral, but look like a Greek architecture, because, he said, the New Testament was written in Greek. And so he introduced columns in the front of the church. That's why when you go by churches, or when you go into a church, there are columns in the front. It's because of Charles Spurgeon. Even we got some. This man made a tremendous impact in Christianity. But did you know that he was married? And he had a wife named Susie Spurgeon. And both of them had a thorn in the flesh. And I want us to see that this morning, because they made it by the grace of God, and so can you. 3 things we're going to look at this morning about their marriage. The first one is this: it was not love at first sight. Charles Spurgeon had been very successful in a small country town called Water Beach near Cambridge. And his ministry began to grow. People in London heard about him at New Park Street Church, and they invited him to come as a trial sermon. He came, and boy, he did not fit in. This was Victorian England. Everything was fashionable. Everything was just right, with the scarves and the buckles and the boots and the hair. And Charles Spurgeon walked in, his hair is everywhere. And he had this big blue polka dot handkerchief in his front pocket. And people could not take their eyes off of him. I mean, he was a laughing stock. The first time Susie Thompson at the time saw him, she didn't like him. He said, I can't stand it. I want a preacher who has some class to him. I mean, he should have a certain demeanor about him that when he walks in, people know God has walked in. They said, this guy right here, he looks like a country bumpkin. What is he doing here? It's not going to work out in London. But when this young man, only 19 years of age, began to preach, God began to work in the lives of the people, and especially young Susie Thompson. She was saved, but she had been backslidden for a long time, and so the preaching of Charles Spurgeon began to work in her heart. Long story short, the leaders at New Park Street called him to be their pastor after just a few trials. They said, we want you. But they said, we're going to give you something if you would just get rid of that handkerchief. And they bought him, literally, they bought him a box of white handkerchief, and they said, would you please throw away that polka dot one, because that's just not going to work. It was a big humor. It was just funny. And sure enough, he came. And Charles and Susie somehow began to spend time together. He encouraged her in her spiritual walk. They would take long walks and talk about the things of God. A year later, they were engaged, and he actually baptized her. And a year after that, they were married and had 2 boys, twins. Now, why do I share that with you this morning? Because many people's understanding of love is more directed by Hollywood and music videos than it is by this book. You see, we are so into the fantasy world, how he looks, how she looks. And I'm not decrying that, because there is a place for that. There is a place for romance. But if as a Christian, and I want the young people to listen to that, if as a Christian we don't begin on the right foundation, we're headed for disaster. When our children, we sit down and talk to them, we explain to them, I said, listen, we don't care who you marry as long as that person is a believer. It's not about what family they come from or how much money they have or how many this and that he has in his life or her life. We want to know, do they know Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior? Because we can work with the rest. Listen to what the Bible says in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14. Paul says, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. That's very important. That's very important. You won't believe how many times I have sat with couples in my office, counseling them. And one of them is not a believer. How can I help them? What authority can I bring into their lives? I do the best I can. And then ultimately I have to come back. Listen, you need a third person in your marriage. And that third person is Jesus Christ. Because I cannot be in your home. I cannot be there when you are quarreling. I cannot be there when all hell breaks loose. But if Jesus Christ is the center of your life, things can go bad, but at least you have someone who will be in the dark of the night saying, come on, come together. You can make this work. It was not love at first sight, but it started on the right foot. They both loved Jesus Christ. But I want us to see the second thing about this couple, that it was patience and prayer that got them through tough times. It was no secret that Charles Spurgeon had God's hand upon his life. Very quickly, and when I say very quickly, I'm talking about in just a matter of weeks, the church exploded. It began to grow by leaps and bounds. This is Victorian England, where things are proper and prim, and everybody, has their gentleman and lady hat on. And Charles Spurgeon, this country boy, comes in and he begins to preach the truth, and he begins to preach with authority, and he begins to preach with humor, and people start coming into the church. And his schedule went from just a couple hours a day to all of a sudden a full schedule. And Susie felt the brunt of that. One time she walked into the vestry, if you know what that means, and Charles Spurgeon was sitting there working on a sermon, spending some time in prayer, and he didn't even recognize her. He got up and looked very gravely and said, "Good morning, madam. It's good to have you here this morning." And sat down and went back to work. And he did that several times. And she would have to look him in the eye and say, "It's me." How many ladies have ever had to go through that when your husband is busy or working or doing something and he's like got that tunnel vision? You have to say, "Hey, look at me." Had to do that with Charles. One time, this is before they got married, he went into this big auditorium crowded with people. And Susie was with him, and they were talking, laughing, joking, but he had so much on his mind. They walk into this crowded place, and immediately he has so much on him, he has to communicate. He completely forgets about her, leaves her in the crowd. I mean, this is a crowd. People are jostling to get in, and walks on and gets on the platform, and he's ready to preach. And she has to find her way through the crowd to get to her seat. She was so mad, she walked out. She walked out, went home to mama, looking for some sympathy. And this future mother-in-law sat the daughter down and said, "Do you believe God has his hand upon Charles?" "Yes, Mom. I know God has anointed him." "Then don't hinder his ministry. Support him. Love him. Encourage him." Praise God for mother-in-laws like that. Amen. Boy, I did get a lot of amen on that one. Because, let me tell you something, if you have friends in your life, if you have neighbors in your life, if you have family in your life who does not give the right advice to that son or to that daughter, it will tear up that marriage. And this mom sat down and said, "Listen, that's not going to be good. Do you know what you're getting into?" And that made a significant impact in Susie's life. And she became a supporter rather than saying, "Look at me, Charles." She began to support him. Now, things began to grow, and this was the least of their worries about busyness. The church began to grow. The decision was made to expand the building, and so they rented a place called Exeter Hall. It no longer exists. I believe it got burned in a fire. It was a large public auditorium that was rented and used for big conferences and conventions, and it could seat about 5,000 people. So that their building could expand and the construction could go on, they rented this place, which was a public place. It was unheard of in Victorian England. How dare you use a public place for the things of God? It's funny to me when people say, come to me, they read a couple of messages or books or get on the web and they say, "I'm old-timey, just like Charles Spurgeon." I don't think you would have liked Charles Spurgeon. He was anything but traditional. He would do everything opposite. If he was living in 2014, I don't know what he would be doing, but he would be packing the church by doing whatever was unconventional. And people began to criticize him. They began to slander him. They began to gossip about him. Listen to what one newspaper said. They said, "The place is jammed to suffocation. All his messages are filled with bad taste, are vulgar, and theatrical." He uses humor in his sermons. Horrible. Another newspaper said about him that, I love to read it the way I bet Victorian England would have read it. "All the most solemn mysteries of our holy religion are by him rudely, roughly, and impiously handled." I cannot believe. And one time somebody said, "Sir, you should not be using that much humor in your message." And you heard his famous line, "If you only knew how much I hold back." You see, sometimes when we read his messages today, we think that's what he preached. No, listen, those have been edited. He has taken out all the anecdotes and funny stuff, and it's pure message, pure doctrine, but there was much more that happened when he got up in the pulpit. And by the way, he didn't use a pulpit. He said, no, I don't need that. He would stand in front of a rail or a chair and preach to 10,000 people. He hated the title Reverend. He said, don't call me Reverend, just Mr. Charles Spurgeon, Mr. Spurgeon. He was anything but traditional. And people criticize him. Churches criticize him. Other pastors made fun of him. And he pretended like nothing happened. It's no big deal. I can take it. But inside, he was eating him up. He couldn't sleep at nights. Listen to what he said. He said, down on my knees have I often fallen with hot sweat rising from my brow under some fresh slander poured upon me. He said, they're saying things about me that are not right. And even Susie, when she heard about this, she said, on one hand, I feel so sad when I see him hurt like that. And on the other hand, it makes me angry for those who are hurting him. Hey, listen, I want to talk to people this morning, this message is not just for church ministry. This is not just about a pastor and his wife. But listen, if your husband, if your wife is in the spotlight, this may be happening to them. And when we criticize them at home as well, when we tear them down in the home, where is the refuge? Where can they go and say it's safe zone? Nobody's going to attack me here. Nobody's going to make fun of me. Nobody's going to bring up the past. Nobody's going to smear me. This is a safe zone. If there is no safe zone, pity that relationship, pity that family. At least in this life, things were being said in the newspapers and the tabloids and with other churches and other people. When they got home, at least there was a safe zone. They moved into the new building. But guess what? It was small again. And once again, they had to expand. I mean, this is happening in a matter of months, folks. They could not rent Exeter Hall again because Exeter Hall was way too small. And so they rented another place. Are you ready for this? The Surrey Music Theater. Can you imagine what people said? You mean to tell me you're going to talk about the things of God in a theater where they have plays and dances? And they tore him down again. Isn't that amazing? That we have such an image of this person, and we think no trouble, no problems. And I don't know, maybe you have a business where people talk bad about it. Maybe you have a position of authority at work and people are saying bad things about you. I just want you to realize you're not the first. Anytime you do something that is successful, somebody somewhere will tear you down. And one night when he was preaching at the Surrey Music Hall, I mean, look at, that's an engraving of that place, and that's him preaching. Somebody in the balcony, some instigators came in. You know, it's always the enemy working. And somebody shouted, fire. Fire. And from another corner of the gallery, somebody else shouted, the galleries are collapsing. The place is coming down. I mean, this place is jam-packed with 12,000 plus people. And there was a mad stampede to the doors. People are trying to get out. And Spurgeon did everything he could to quiet the public down. Remember, there is no microphone. There is no sound system. He is preaching without anything that we have today. He did the best he could to pray, to gather the crowd together, but it was no use. Somebody else shouted fire, and once again those instigators did what they wanted to do. And Spurgeon turned from that pulpit, from that place where he was standing, and immediately collapsed. He had a breakdown. He had a breakdown. You heard of a nervous breakdown? Charles Spurgeon had a nervous breakdown. They had to carry him out the side door. His wife wasn't there that night. She was home with her 2 little boys. And she didn't even know this is a time before cell phones and text messages and Facebook messages, so she had no way of knowing what was happening. Next thing you know, a cab pulls up, and they bring in this young preacher, and he looked like death worn over. Listen to what Susie Thompson said about this night. She said, I wanted to be alone that I might cry to God in this hour of darkness and death. When my beloved was brought home, he looked a wreck. He looked a wreck. An hour's agony of mind had changed his whole appearance and bearing. And all night he cried and he wailed and he groaned. Nothing could quiet him. Went into like a catatonic state. Seven people died that night in the stampede. 7 people. And 28 plus were severely injured through that mad stampede. Those were some very, very difficult days in the life of this couple. They didn't know what was going to happen next. I mean, it was not the music, it was not the ministries, it was not the building that was bringing the people. God's hand was upon this young man named Charles, and now he is lying there refusing to get up. He can't move, he can't think. All he does is he cries. And a day or two later, Susie could work with him. Praise God for wives like that, amen? Who would encourage you, who would pat you on the back and say, come on, let's take a walk around the garden. They were at a friend's house. They said, come, why don't y'all come over here? We have a big garden. You need to back off for a while. And they were taking a walk in the garden, just taking baby steps, just trying to get by. And they were praying the whole time as they were walking. And suddenly his face lit up. God answers prayers. Suddenly his face lit up and he looked at Susie and he said, oh my goodness. All this time I was thinking that it was me. I was the one who was carrying this work. I was thinking I'm the one who is doing this, but it's not about me. It's about Jesus Christ, isn't it? So if I die, if nothing works out with me, so be it, as long as he is glorified. With such a difficult time in his life, he stayed out of the pulpit just 1 week and he was back in preaching stronger than ever. Prayer works. I don't know what you're facing in your life, in your marriage, in your home, in your work, not just church ministry. Prayer does work. When you turn to God and say, God, I don't know what's happening, he will bring truth in your life. And what does the Bible say? The truth shall set you free. The truth set this young man free. Let me remind you once again. Anytime something good happens, the enemy will not be happy. Just get used to that. Anytime something good happens, not just in the church, but in your own life, in your own home, when you see things going good, get on your knees and pray, because this is the time you need to prepare. I'm not calling you to be paranoid. I'm not calling you to be a pessimist. I'm just warning you because the enemy is waiting. His purpose is to divide homes, to divide marriages, to divide churches. That's what he works with. He will bring in gossip. He will bring in slander. He will bring somebody who will whisper and say things. And I pray to God that none of us would be in that position where the enemy is using us. Did y'all hear that this morning? And when he comes in and starts whispering, you say, not me. This mind and this heart is not open to you, because I don't want to become your instrument. But when both husband and wife, when the family, when the church comes together, and instead of turning on each other, they turn towards each other, there's incredible strength. Listen to what it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4 and verse 7. Love suffers long and is kind. Love suffers long and is kind. It bears all things. It believes all things. It hopes all things. It endures all things. We need that kind of love at Clearview. We need that kind of love in our homes. We need that kind of love in our marriages. It suffers long and is kind. But I want you to see the last point. This is very important. It was weakness that poured more grace on them. It was weakness. The new building was finally finished, and they changed the name. I told you he was very unconventional. He changed the name from New Park Street Church to the Metropolitan Tabernacle. That was unheard of. And the church was growing by leaps and bounds. In fact, the outside edifice still exists. The inside, they had to kind of reduce the size of the building because nobody since Charles Spurgeon could ever fill that big structure. The church continued to grow. His writing ministry began to grow. Susie was helping him, was right by him, traveling with him. She started a book fund to help pastors who didn't have much money, and they would send him his messages, his books for free. He had more speaking engagements than ever. It seemed like things were going great. I mean, they've been through the tough times of life, and now they're upward and onward. And then in 1868, Susie was only 36 years of age. She became terribly sick. Incredible pain in her body. She even had a major surgery done, and it eased some of the pain, but it was very clear for the rest of her life, she would be a semi-invalid. She couldn't get out anymore. At just 36 years of age. Charles Spurgeon, on the other hand, doing great things, wonderful things. Remember, he was a couple of years younger than her. At the age of 35, his body also began to break down. He had a severe form of rheumatoid arthritis, and it was especially bad. Many of y'all struggle with something similar to that. It was especially bad when the temperatures were low or the weather became cold and damp. He could not get out of his bed. He struggled with gout. And I tell you what, that can be really, really painful. He could not put his foot on the ground. He had to stay in bed days and weeks at a time. Listen to how he described it. He wrote it to his congregation because he could not preach. He said, I have been brought very low. My flesh has been tortured with pain, and my spirit has been prostrate with depression. He said, with very much difficulty, I write these lines in my bed, mingling them with the groans of pain and the songs of hope. 36 years of age, and she is a semi-invalid, 35 years of age, and his body is riddled with pain. But something worse was coming. Something that there might be people here this morning who struggle with. It was depression. Remember the incident that night when there was a fire Somebody called fire in the church, and they had to carry him out. He collapsed. He had a breakdown. Something triggered up here in his mind. Something slipped up here. This same man we're talking about, 12,000 people in church, 10,000 waiting outside, writing books. If you go to a divinity school library, you will see books by Charles Spurgeon all over the place. Of any preacher, he has the most volumes. I mean, shelves and shelves that he has written. Pastor's college that he started. Orphanage. All these wonderful things going on. And depression as a dark cloud came upon him. Listen to how he described it. He said, my spirits were sunken so low that I could weep by the hour like a child. And yet I knew not what I wept for, weeping uncontrollably, and didn't know why. If you ever talk to people who have struggled with depression, they will tell you that's exactly what happens. At times he had to be out of the pulpit for weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks at a time. Many times Susie would sit by his bedside and she would try to read books to him, just to help him, just to help him get up. And he would say the heaviness would lift, and then a week later, a month later, the heaviness would return. And sadly, Susie herself fell into depression. I mean, now this sounds so contrary, doesn't it? If you serve the Lord, if you're good to the Lord, if you obey the Lord, good things should be happening. Amen? That's not always the case. That's not always the case. Let me ask you a question this morning. Where did Spurgeon disobey the Lord? Was there sin in his life? Was he a bad person? Was he doing something on the side that we don't know about? No, he was serving God. He was loving God. Both of them were on fire for God, and yet depression came into their lives. At age 57, he continued to serve the Lord. The ministry kept growing by leaps and bounds, even through those times, especially during those times. His body could not take it, and at 57 years of age, he lay on his deathbed. And his wife was there with him, and he would call her wifey, and she would call him Tirshata. Now, Tirshata is in the book of Nehemiah, which means the revered one. Remember, Spurgeon did not like to be called reverend, so she called him Tirshata, just like a little jab. Well, if you don't want me to call you reverend, I'm just going to call you Tirshata, which meant the same thing. And he looked at her on his deathbed, and he said, you know, I've had such a blessed time with the Lord. If I had to do it all over again, I would not choose any different. I would not choose a different life. No bitterness, no regret, no anger, no frustration, no doubts, just gratefulness. God has been good to me. You see, both Charles and Susie understood this passage that I want to read to you as we close. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Verses 8 through 10. Remember, Paul asked the Lord, God, would you take this thorn in the flesh away from me? And he pleaded 3 times, which means he asked the Lord, would you take this problem away? And I want you to hear me very carefully, because every person sitting here this morning has a thorn in the flesh. It might not be depression. It may not be arthritis. It might not be any of that. It might be a relationship. It might be a person. But there is a thorn in the flesh. But what did God tell Paul? Listen to verse 9. My grace is sufficient for you. For my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, Paul says, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. You see, your thorn in the flesh is not against you, it is for you. It gives God the opportunity to bless you. There are many Christians who have become bitter and angry, and they don't pray anymore because they feel like no use. God doesn't answer. God is answering your prayer. That thorn in the flesh has been placed there to be a blessing, to keep you humble, to keep you from being puffed up and become like the enemy. But listen to the last line of that passage. Therefore I take pleasures in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. When you are weak, it gives God the opportunity to be strong through your life. Did you know over 100,000 people showed up to Charles Spurgeon's funeral? 100,000. His writings, his works are all over the world. Even as a little boy growing up far away in India, I remember seeing his books, his booklets, his sermons in Dad's library. How amazing is that? And may I tell you this morning, if they made it through all their struggles and their trials, you can too. Thank you for watching us online. We would love for you to join us for one of our 3 weekend services. Saturday night at 6:30 for our Ignite service, and Sunday mornings at 8:15 and 10:45. We also have Sunday school at 9:30 for all age groups. Visit us online at clearviewbc.org for all other programs and activities. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook so you can keep up with the latest updates. Thank you once again for watching us, and feel free to check out some of our other videos. God bless.